Festival City of Literature programme here in the Festival Gardens. It's a beautiful day out there, so thank you for taking the time to come in out of the sun and join us. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Johann Hari to Norwich. We're going to be speaking for the next hour. Well, not only us will be speaking, we'll also ask you to speak as well. We'll be talking about, through, with, over, everything we know about depression wrong. Johann is a New York Times best-selling author. Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, has been translated into over 15 languages now, I think. It's currently being adapted into a Hollywood film, and also a documentary series is being made of it at the moment. His talk, Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong, on TED, alongside the animation based on it, has been viewed over 20 million times. He's written over recent years for some of the most leading newspapers, including New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Guardian, Spectator, Le Monde Diplomatique, the Melbourne Age, and Politico. He appears on TV, radio. You appear everywhere, all media, all of the time, according to this. It's very impressive. No, popular. He's also twice named National Newspaper Journalist of the Year by Amnesty, and has been named as a Cultural Commentator of the Year and Environmental Commentator of the Year at the Comment Awards. I think it's a really timely book, Lost Connections, uncovering the real causes of depression and the unexpected solutions. It's caused a lot of debate. It's caused a real sort of conversation, or carried forward a conversation that's been happening. I wondered if we could kind of start, Johann, by kind of perhaps drawing back a little and giving us an idea of the big picture and why this book, why now?
Sure.
Let me just test that for you.
The on button. No?
Give it another go.
Hello. I always get tempted to do like the Charlton Heston voice of like hello. The Charlton Heston voice of God. Would it be better for you guys at the back if we stood up? Because you can't really see us, can you? Okay, great. That's actually better for me because my back is killing me. I've been on a train for ages, so it works out for us all. Yeah, I'm really chuffed to be here. I'm actually really relieved they've given us one of these kind of microphones, because I had this slightly weird experience about whenever it was 5 years ago. I had to give a TED talk, and they made me wear one of those those microphones you put on your head. And when they put it on, I said, if you make me wear this, I'm going to feel like Madonna. And the technician looked at me really intensely, and he said, you should always feel like Madonna. So now when I have to wear one of them, I get this really strong urge to sing Papa Don't Preach. And the fact that we've got this like beat behind us is really fueling that sense of like, why should I do that? I'm also I'm a little bit self-conscious about, which I always feel I should just be honest about. So after this, I'm going to do one of those book signing things. But one of the first times I ever did a book signing, people were like queuing up, and one woman said to me, would you write something for my husband? And I said, sure, what would you like me to write? She said, I want you to write, Dear Peter, it's over, I never loved you anyway. And she got really pissed off that I wouldn't do it. So I will write things in your books, but like within reason. So you asked about why now?
Yeah.
And so there were these two kind of, the reason I wrote the book is because there were these two kind of mysteries that were really hanging over me that I couldn't find the answer to and that I wanted to understand. The first is, I'm 39 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased in Britain and across the Western world. I wanted to understand why, partly for a very personal reason. When I was a teenager, I'd gone to my doctor and I'd explained that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me and I couldn't control it, I didn't understand it, I felt quite ashamed of it. And my doctor told me a story about why I felt this way that I now realise was a really oversimplified story. He said, we know why people feel like this. There's a chemical called serotonin in people's brains that makes them feel good. Some people are naturally lacking this chemical, or they've got an imbalance in it. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you these drugs. And he gave me an antidepressant called Seroxat, which did give me really significant relief initially. But then I had this feeling of pain came back, so I went back to the doctor. He said I didn't give you a high enough dose. He gave me a higher dose. Again, I felt better. Again, this feeling of pain came back, and I was really in this cycle of jacking up the dose again and again, until for 13 years I was taking the maximum possible dose you're allowed to take, at the end of which I was still depressed. I was experiencing all sorts of horrible side effects like massive weight gain. And so I wanted to understand, according to this story I'd been told, I was doing everything I should do, and yet I still felt really acutely depressed. So to try to find the answers to these two mysteries, I ended up going on this big long journey. I travelled over 40,000 miles. I wanted to meet the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, and people with really different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have really low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil where they banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people magic mushrooms to see if that helped. Ask me afterwards. And I learned loads of things, but to me the core of what I learned is, I realised, until I went to my doctor when I was a teenager, I thought my depression was all in my head, meaning I was just being weak, I needed to man up. And then for the next 13 years, I thought my depression was all in my head, meaning it was just a chemical imbalance in my brain. But what I learned is there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are in fact biological. Your genes can make you more sensitive to depression, or they don't write your fate. And there are real changes that happen in your brain that can make it harder to get out of depression. But most of the causes are not in our brains, they're not in our heads, they're factors in the way we live. And that opens up a very different way of dealing with depression and anxiety, a whole different set of responses that I've seen at work all over the world that should be offered alongside chemical antidepressants, not in place of them.
Thank you. And you've been a professional journalist for a long time, and a writer and a broadcaster for a long time. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about your previous sort of dealings professionally in written terms with depression, and what you'd talked about and how that was about to change when the research on this book started.
Yeah. The first bit of the research was the hardest, apart from one bit later that we might get to, because it was really startling to me to realise that story my doctor told me is not true. So the leading expert at Princeton University, Professor Andrew Scull, says, these are his words, "It's deeply misleading and unscientific to say depression is caused by low serotonin." One of the leading experts in Britain, Dr. David Healy, says you can't even say that story has been discredited, because there was never a time when it was credited. There was never a time when half the scientists in the field would have told you depression was caused by low serotonin. That doesn't mean there's no value to chemical antidepressants. There is some value. And I think we need to have a slightly more complex and nuanced conversation about this than we normally have. So depression is measured, one of the ways depression is measured is something called the Hamilton scale. I've always felt really sorry for whoever Hamilton was, that we only remember him by how miserable we all are. But anyway, and to give you a sense of it, that Hamilton scale goes from 1, where you would be dancing around in ecstasy, maybe on ecstasy, to 51, where you would be acutely suicidal. And to give you a sense of movement on the Hamilton scale, if you improve your sleep patterns, you'll gain 6 points on the Hamilton scale. And if your sleep patterns deteriorate, like when you have a baby, you'll generally go 6 points the other way. The leading expert at Harvard Medical School, Professor Irving Kirsch, looked at all the studies of chemical antidepressants, including the ones the pharmaceutical companies didn't want us to see. And what he showed is, on average, chemical antidepressants give you a boost of 1.8 points on the Hamilton scale. Now, it's important to say a few things about that. That's an average, so some people get more. I got more initially, over time I got less. It's also important to say 1.8 points ain't nothing, right? For some people, that will those benefits will outweigh the side effects and are really worth having. But once you understand that, you can see, I think, the harder statistic, which is, if you look at the long-term research on antidepressants, most people who are prescribed antidepressants by their doctor become depressed again. Doesn't mean the drug has no value, but it's not enough to solve depression for most of us. Partly because it's based on the wrong story about why we feel this way. And at first, I found this really hard, because if you've got a story about your pain, even if that story isn't working very well for you, and it wasn't working very well for me, at least you feel like you know where you are, right? If your depression is like a wild animal, a story puts it on a leash, right? You feel you understand it. And that moment of that story coming apart was very destabilizing for me, very uncomfortable. I resisted it for a long time. But there was, and obviously there are many things that I discovered later, but there was one moment when I began to see a different way of thinking about antidepressants. I went to see this South African psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield. And Derek happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants in Cambodia. And the local Cambodian doctors didn't know what these drugs were. So they asked him and he explained. And they said to him, "Oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants." And he said, "What do you mean?" He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy, like St. John's wort or something. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields, and one day he stood on a landmine and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb, and he went back to work in the rice fields after a while. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. I'm guessing it was traumatic because he's gone back to the place where he got blown up. The guy starts to cry all day. After a while, he refuses to get out of bed. It's classic depression. They said to Derek, well, that's why we gave him an antidepressant. And Derek said, well, what? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realised that his pain made sense, that it wasn't some irrational malfunction. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Derek, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds like a joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant and he gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not crazy, you're not a machine with broken parts, you're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical support to get those deeper needs met. Everyone in this room knows that you've got natural physical needs, right? Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need clean air, you need shelter. If I took any of them away from you, you'd be in real trouble real quickly, right? But there's equally strong evidence that human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. Our culture is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today. Dentistry, gay rights, Kylie, all sorts of things. But our culture has been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs for people. And it's not the only thing that's going on, but I think it's the key reason why every year our depression and anxiety crisis keeps rising and rising. So a big part of what I was trying to discover for the book was, well, what is the cow for the things that are making us depressed? Anything that reduces depression and anxiety should be regarded as an antidepressant. Part of that should be chemical antidepressants, which do give some relief to some people, but many more things should be regarded as antidepressants. And I go through lots of ones that I saw working all over the world.
Thank you. I think we'll definitely come back, to this notion of two things, really. Listening, which I think you really identify as a crucial and active activity within the context of the book, and also the fact that depression makes sense, that there is a contextual sense and rationale for being depressed, for the things that depression might lead you to do and feel and think, and how that kind of plays into it. But can I again just sort of pull you ever so slightly backwards and think, kind of when you were with your doctor, you described going to your doctor and being told a story that was too simplified, and that didn't, and you knew at some point it didn't work, but you had written about the positive benefits of antidepressants and Prozac, and you told a very effective story about that moment in the medical storytelling around depression, if we can call it that, where Prozac and its SSRI kind of family were deemed to be the answer to depression. At the end, they were almost going to create a super race of people who were highly functional. And you bought
and that one worked out well, didn't it?
but you had bought and written about that story.
Totally, I believed it very strongly, partly because that's the only story I was offered that was the alternative to you're weak, you're feeble, man up, right? And if those are the two choices, either you're weak and feeble or you're biologically broken, you're going to choose being biologically broken. But what I'm trying to say is there's a third way of understanding this, which happens to be the view of the leading medical bodies in the world and the best scientific evidence. So you've got to look at what else was happening as that story is rising, right? That story that it's just a biological break in our brains. What else is going on in the world? So lots of, not all of them, but lots of the factors that cause depression and anxiety that I write about were rising. I'll give you an example. We are the loneliest culture there has ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none. There are more people who have nobody to turn to than any other option. We are just behind the Americans in the league tables of loneliness, international, kind of very sad, international league tables of loneliness. And I spent a lot of time with interviewing an amazing man called Professor John Cassiopo, who's at the University of Chicago, who's the leading expert in the world on loneliness. Sadly, he just died, which is a terrible loss. And he proved many things. He proved that for a human being, if you become acutely lonely, you will release as much of the stress hormone cortisol as if a stranger punches you in the face, right? Loneliness is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being seriously obese. It's devastating physically. He proved that it causes depression. And I was saying to him, well, why is that? Why does it have this effect on us? And he said, well, look, why are we alive? Any of us here, why are we alive, right? One key reason is that our ancestors in the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down a lot of the time. They weren't faster than the animals they took down a lot of the time. What they were was much better at banding together in groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to need a hive, humans evolved to need a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to try to disband our tribes and think we can do this alone. And it's making us feel terrible. So again, one of the things I was thinking about, well, what is the antidepressant for that, right? What's the cow for that? And one of the heroes of my book is an amazing man called Dr. Sam Everington. Sam is a GP in East London, a very poor part of East London where I lived for a long time, though unfortunately he was never my doctor. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants. He thinks they have some role, but he knew perfectly well the evidence is much more complex than it's just a chemical imbalance. He could see exactly what you're saying, that their pain made sense. So one day he decided to pioneer a different approach. A woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know quite well. Lisa had been shut away in her home with crippling depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'm going to carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to prescribe something else. I'm going to prescribe for you to take part in a group. There was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like. It backed onto a park. And he said to Lisa, what I'd like you to do is come and turn up twice a week. I'm going to turn out and support you. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. Sam talked about how he'd had a lot of anxiety. And what we're going to do is turn Dog Shit Alley into something nice, right? First time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But a couple of things happened as this group kept meeting. The first thing was Lisa realised they had something to talk about that wasn't how shit they felt, right? Normally with depressed people, we either drug them or we give them a chance to talk about their pain. Both have some value. In this case, they had something totally different. They decided they were going to learn gardening and build a garden. These were inner city EastEnders like me who didn't know anything about gardening. They decided they were going to get their fingers in the soil. They started to literally plunge their hands in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. Something else happened. They started to form a tribe. They started to get to know each other. And they did what we do as human beings when we're part of a tribe. They started to solve each other's problems. For example, there was one guy in the group. It's an extreme example, but he'd been thrown out of his house. He was sleeping on the night bus. And everyone in the group was like, of course you're depressed if you're sleeping on the bus, right? They started pressuring the local council, Tower Hamlets Council, to get this guy a home. They succeeded. It was the first time they'd done something for someone else in years, and it made them feel great. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program, which is part of a growing body of evidence, that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason. It was dealing with some of the reasons, their disconnection from other people, their disconnection from the natural world, why the people in the group felt so bad. And this is something I kept seeing all over the world. The best strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we feel like this. Because they're real reasons and they make perfect sense. And it's not like rocket science, right? These are fairly intuitive things.
Absolutely. I think it brings up 2 points for me that I think would be worth kind of just addressing before we go further. Because I think that the stories in the book are really powerful. There's a wide range of stories, but stories aren't science and stories aren't evidence. and stories are metaphor and all sorts of other things which are very tempting in lots of directions, but you can take them in lots of different ways. So I want to ask you two things before we kind of go further. First of all, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about placebo and the studies of the placebo effect and how that feeds into the central argument of your story, that we need to look beyond the chemical explanation, not just for the diagnosis and treatment of depression and depressive illnesses, but also an understanding of their genesis and the etiology of those things.
I don't have much to say about it. I mean, I go through it in the book, but some of it's the placebo effect, but some of it isn't, so, I mean, some people think it's entirely placebo, some people think the effect is mainly placebo, and there's a debate about that, but yeah.
I suppose my point is that I should have made at the start is that I think I want to be very clear, kind of for this session, that this book is not saying don't take antidepressants.
No,
at
absolutely
all.
not. I say very clearly in the book, if and it says to everyone here, and it says to some of my closest relatives who, on my advice, continue to take these drugs, if for you the benefits are outweighing the side effects, you should carry on taking them. I think that's unambiguous. But we just have to be honest. Most people taking the drugs become depressed again, right? Doesn't mean the drugs have no effect, but it means we've got to have a much bigger and deeper conversation and a much bigger and deeper range of responses to this problem. And the fact that we just reflexively, pretty much all we offer is drugs and a little bit of CBT, which tells you that it's your own personal thinking that's, I mean, there are some good CBT practitioners, but, that mostly tells you it's just your own thought patterns that are going wrong. I mean, think about that guy in Cambodia. It wasn't his he didn't need to be told his thought patterns were going wrong. He needed a cow, right? And I think we're much more like that than I mean, of course there are, your thought patterns can affect you in negative ways, and of course there's some value in that, but I don't think it's the main thing that's going on.
No, I mean, there is a real debate, and the meta-studies around antidepressant functioning are still a really live area of science and practice that we shouldn't abandon by any stretch of the imagination.
No, of course not. I mean, but the best long-term research we have is, so-called the STAR-D trial. It's really simple, you can't rig it, you just follow, people go to their doctor completely normally, they sound depressed, can you help me? And they just follow those people over time to see what happens to them. So that can't be rigged in the way some of the pharmaceutical trials, there's a big debate about a lot of them have all sorts of distortions. And in those long-term studies, most people become depressed again, right? Again, it doesn't mean there's no value, but we've just got to be honest about it, right?
Yeah, and obviously we entirely have no reason at all to distrust large pharmacological corporations or international corporations, so that's a useful thing to remember.
Yeah, I mean, they know, but they're not. This is not a kind of big pharma does some good things and some bad things,
absolutely.
And it's not. It would be foolish to blanketly reject the things they offer, because a lot of the things are fantastic. So
But some of the revelations around the nature of their study are fascinating and do kind of throw some light on the medical models that we've had in the 80s and 90s at least. The second point that I wanted to, that you reminded me of when you were talking, which I thought was incredibly powerful, was when you compared the symptoms of depression, and both mental and physical and social, with those of grief. And
this is so interesting.
How did that arise for you, and where do you take it?
So I learned about this from an amazing woman called Professor Johann Hari, and then did a lot of background. So in the 1970s, something really strange was discovered about depression, and it was so inconvenient it was swept under the rug where it remains today. So a group called the American Psychological Association, who are like the body of psychiatrists in the US, decided for the first time they were going to standardize how they diagnosed depression across the entire US. Because up to then, doctors were just calling their patients depressed based on their own criteria, and they're like, we've got to figure out a way to properly do this, right? So the American Psychological Association, the APA, drew up a list of 10 symptoms, which are kind of obvious things, right? They're things that you could guess. Crying a lot, feeling worthless, that kind of thing. And they said to psychiatrists, if any of your patients show more than 5 of these symptoms for more than 2 weeks, diagnose them as mentally ill, do what you can to help them. So they send this out to psychiatrists and GPs across the US, and they start to use them. But then, within a couple of months, they start to notice this slightly inconvenient thing, right? They come back to the APA and they're like, well, hang on, we've got a bit of a problem here. If we use this checklist the way you're telling us to, we're going to have to diagnose every grieving person in the United States as depressed. Because these are the symptoms of grief, right? When someone you love dies, you feel this way. And the APA were like, oh shit, that's not what we meant. So they got together and they created something that became known as the grief loophole, where they said, okay, use these 10 symptoms. If you have more than 5 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, diagnose them as depressed, unless someone they love has died in the last year, in which case it's a perfectly understandable response. They're not mad. Don't do anything, right? Except be nice to them. So they start using this, but this started to beg a really awkward question, right? So psychiatrists started to come back and go, hang on a minute, you're saying that depression is just a brain disease that can just be identified with a checklist, except there is one situation and only one situation in life where actually it's a totally understandable response. Well, why is someone you love dying the only situation where that's an understandable response? Why not if you've lost your job? Why not if you've lost your home? Why not if you're stuck in a job you hate for the next 40 years? We can all imagine loads of situations, right? But once you admit that, as Professor Cassiatore says, one of the great experts on this says, the whole system is not built to accommodate that. That requires us to think about the context of the individual's life, rather than just their brain on a checklist, right? And Dr. Cassiatore is really fascinating. She became an expert on this when her own child died her baby Cheyenne died when she was very young. And Dr. Cassiatore was horrified to discover how many grieving parents are immediately drugged. So she starts working with grieving parents, routinely. I mean, it's not quite as bad in Britain, but it's bad. I mean, routinely in the US, grieving parents have been given antipsychotic drugs. It's extraordinary. And I think it really reveals something fundamental. Firstly, that reveals how wrong the debate has gone, right? That if you stay stuck in that very narrow model that's been built by psychiatrists, that there are lots of good psychiatrists see the problems in, then you can't acknowledge the reality of the person's life in a complex way. But I think more importantly, I think it reveals something, that grief and depression have the same symptoms. I think what depression is partly grief for your own life not going the way it should. I think depression is in part grief for your own needs not being met. It's not coincidence they've got the same symptoms. That's very meaningful. And obviously, just say one thing about that, when someone we love dies and we grieve for them, firstly, that's not a mental illness, right? We grieve for people because we have loved them, because they were really meaningful to us. When that happens, obviously, we can't bring the person back. What we can do is show love and support and compassion for the people who survive. But when we're grieving for our own needs not being met, well, there's loads we can do about that, right? We can get those deeper needs met. Now, some of that requires big social changes. Some of that is things we can do as individuals. But that requires a very different way of thinking about it. And I think most people, when they see... So when you learn, for example, 9% of grieving parents are drugged in the first 48 hours after their child dies. Most people instinctively know, well, there's something not right about that, right? They're not mad. They're not mentally ill. Actually, they're responding in the right way. In fact, what would be mad is if your child died and you weren't very distressed, right? I think we need to have more of that understanding when it comes to depression. Depression is a signal. It's telling us something, right? I spend a lot of my time in the US, and one of the things that never fails to amaze me is a trivial comparison, but perfectly normal Americans, when you're eating, will offer you indigestion pills. And I always want to say to them, well, wait, no, indigestion isn't a malfunction, right? Indigestion is a signal from your body that you're eating too fast. You need to listen to that signal, otherwise you're going to put on weight, you're going to have really bad digestion, it's going to screw you up, right? Now, indigestion is pretty trivial and depression is the worst thing I've ever been through. But I think in a similar way, depression is a signal that is telling us something really profound. The fact that we live in a country where 1 in 10 people at any given time is having to drug themselves to get through the day, and lots more people are really depressed and anxious and aren't drugging themselves to get through the day, are coping or not coping in other ways, that's telling us something, right? The fact that keeps rising is a really important signal. I think if we had listened to that signal years ago, we wouldn't have President Trump and we wouldn't have Brexit. That's another debate. But you see what I mean? Pain, we've got to listen to pain, not pathologise pain.
I'm glad to see you're not afraid of opening up the direction of travel, many directions at once there. So thinking about that, the notion of depression and the grief-shapedness of depression, if you like, being a message or an indication or some sort of response to your needs not being met. One of the lovely, genuinely lovely and eye-opening parts of reading this book was you're ranging across 50 to 60 years of evidence when you identify those 9 kind of causes, as you describe them, or 9 factors which condition perhaps or instigate or prolong or perpetuate depressive feelings. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey across that sort of 50 years of evidence and kind of how you brought it all together?
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I can tell you about all the experts I met and I learned a huge amount from the leading experts in the world. But there was a place I kept going back to all the way through writing this book. And I think these people taught me at least as much as the experts. So to tell you the story of who these people are. In the summer of 2011, a woman called Nuria Cengiz climbed out of her wheelchair and stuck a sign in the window of her flat. She lived on a big council estate in a place called Kotti in Berlin. And the sign in her window that she stuck up said something like, I got a notice saying I'm going to be evicted from my flat next Thursday night. So on Wednesday night, I'm going to kill myself. Now, this is a big council estate where no one knew anyone, like a lot of estates in Britain. It's actually in a slightly weird area. It's a quite poor part of Berlin. So the only people who lived there were recent Muslim immigrants like Nuria, gay men, and punk squatters. And as you can imagine, these 3 groups looked at each other with a bit of incomprehension, right? Now, no one knew each other. No one knew this woman who'd put this sign in her window. People started to knock on her door. They said, do you need any help? Nuria said, fuck off, I don't want your help, I'm going to kill myself. And what they started talking outside the flat, some people who didn't know each other. And one of them had an idea. There's a big thoroughfare that goes through the centre of this housing project, Kotti, into the middle of Berlin, into Mitte. And he had this idea. If we just blocked the road for a day and we wheel Nuria out, the media will probably protest a bit because they were all pissed. Everyone's rent was going up, so they were all pissed off. The media will come. There'll be a bit of a fuss. They'll probably let her stay in her flat, right? There might even be a bit of fuss to keep our rents down. So they decided to do it one Saturday. They did the next Saturday that came. They did it. They blocked it. And Nuria was like, well, I'm going to kill myself anyway. I may as well sit in the middle of the road. They wheeled Nuria out, and the media came. And it got to the end of the day, and the police came along and they said, okay, you've had your fun, take it down. And the people at Kotti said, well, hang on a minute. You hadn't told Nuria she gets to stay. And we want a rent freeze for this whole council estate. So when we've got them, then we'll take the barricade down. But of course they knew the minute they walked away, the police would just tear it down anyway, right? So one of my favourite people at Kotti, a woman called Tanya Gartner, who's she's one of the punk squatters. She wears tiny miniskirts even in Berlin winters. She's hardcore. Tanya had this idea. She went up to her flat and she had a klaxon, you know, those things that make a really loud noise at football matches. So she went and got it. She came down and she said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to drop a timetable to man this barricade. We're going to man it 24 hours a day. If the police come to take it down, let off the klaxon, we'll all come down from our flats and we'll all stop them. So people start to sign up to man this barricade, people who would never have met, extremely unlikely pairings. Nuria, in her full hijab, was paired with Tanya in her, it's basically a belt, right? And they got, if I remember right, the Wednesday night shift or Thursday night shift, right? They sit there together. First few times they sit there together, we're like, we got nothing to talk about, right? It could not be more different. As the nights went on, they discovered they had something really powerful in common. Nuria had come to Berlin when she was 17 from Turkey with her 2 young children. And the idea was that she would earn enough money to send back for her husband who was still in Turkey. Sitting there in the cold in Kotti one night, Nuria told Tanya something she'd never told anyone. After she'd been in Berlin for a year, she got word from home that her husband had died. She'd always told people that he died of a heart attack. Actually, he died of tuberculosis, which was seen as like a shameful disease of poverty. That's when Tanya told Nuria something she didn't talk about. She'd come to Kotti when she was 15. She got thrown out by a middle-class family. She came to live in one of the punk squats in Kotti. She got pregnant quite quickly. They realised they'd both been children with children themselves in this place they didn't really understand. All over Kotti there were these pairings of people who were realising how much they had in common. Opposite this council estate, there's a gay club called Zudblock. which to give you a sense, the guy who runs it is called Rick Stein. I love him. To give you a sense of what he's like and what they're like, the previous place he owned was called Cafe Anal. I've always thought you wouldn't want to have a sandwich from Cafe Anal, but anyway. And when they'd opened this gay club a couple of years before the protests began, as you can imagine, there's a lot of religious Muslims in this area. People had smashed the windows, there'd been real anger. When the protests began, this club started saying, they gave all their furniture to the protest. They started saying, you can have your meetings in our club if you want. We'll give you free food, we'll give you free drink. And at first, even the lefties at Kotti were like, we're not going to get these really religious Muslims to come and have, meetings underneath a poster for fisting night, right? It's not going to happen. But it did start happening, as one of the women there said to me, we all realised we had to take these small steps to get to know each other. After the protest had been going on for about a year, one day a guy turned up at this protest called Tung Kai, who was in his early 50s, and he'd been living homeless. When you meet Tung Kai, it's clear he's got some kind of cognitive difficulties. He's got an amazing energy about him. Everyone immediately liked him. He started helping them. He united the Muslims, the gays, and the punks. And after a while, they'd actually, by this time, built, the barricade had been turned into a permanent structure with a roof and everything. And they started saying, you should start sleeping here. We don't want you sleeping in the street. You should sleep here. So he started living there. And it became a much loved part of the camp. After he'd been there for 9 months, one day the police came. They would come and inspect every now and then. They came, and Tung Kai doesn't like it when people argue. He thought they were arguing, so he went to try to hug one of the police officers. They thought he was attacking them, so they arrested him. That was when it was discovered. Tung Kai had been shut away in a psychiatric hospital, often in a padded cell, for 20 years. He'd escaped, he'd lived on the streets for a month, and he'd made his way to Kotti. So they took him back to this psychiatric hospital, right the other side of Berlin, in Charlottenburg. At which point the whole of the Kotti protest turned into a kind of free Tung Kai movement, right? They descend on this psychiatric hospital. I remember how bizarre the psychiatrists thought it was. That suddenly they've got these like very camp gay men, these Muslim women in hijabs, and these punks demanding the release of this person they've had locked away for 20 years. But I remember Uli, one of the protesters there, saying to them, "But you don't love him. He doesn't belong with you. We love him. He belongs with us." And I remember thinking, how many of us, if someone carried us away, would have hundreds of people descending, saying, "No, you don't get to take this person away. We look after this person." Many things happened at Kotti. They got Tung Kai back. It took a while. They got a rent freeze for their entire council estate. They then launched a referendum to keep rents down across the city. They got the largest number of written signatures in the history of the city of Berlin. But the last time I saw Nuria, she said to me, "I'm really glad I got to stay in my neighbourhood. That's great. I gained so much more than that. I was surrounded by these amazing people all along, and I never knew." One of her friends, Neriman, who's one of the Turkish-German women there, said to me that when she'd grown up in Turkey, she'd grown up in a village, and she called her whole village home. And then she came to live in the Western world, and she learned that what we're meant to call home is just our four walls. And she said, then this protest began, and I started to call this whole place and all these people my home. And it made me realise, in some sense, in this culture, we are homeless. You need to feel you belong. Our sense of home is not big enough for that. The Bosnian writer Alexander Heyman said, home is where people notice when you're not there. And the thing that became so clear to me, I think the people at Kotti think I'm slightly mad because I would turn up every few months and just burst into tears how moving they were. And one of them said to one time, "I think, Johann, maybe you have allergies?" I was like, no, it's just... But to me, what was so clear there is think about how distressed those people were. So many of them. Most of them did not need to be drugged. They needed to be together. They needed meaning and purpose in their lives. I remember sitting outside the gay club with Tanya once and her saying to me, when you feel like shit and you're all alone, you think there's something wrong with you. But what we did is we came out of our corner crying and we started to fight. And we realised we were surrounded by people like us. And we realised how strong we could be. And to me, what the people at Kotti were learning in there, obviously this is not a scientific experiment, I kept thinking about it because what I was learning from these scientists, there are obviously many factors and not all of them play out at Kotti, was what we lost and what we need. And to me, that's so important. You can see those people were not crazy to feel bad. A society of people who are acutely lonely, who are taught that life is about money and buying junk and screaming at each other on screens, through screens, and displaying the crap you buy through screens, that is going to be a society with a depression and anxiety crisis for a really good reason. That's not a way of living that gives us what we need.
It's a really powerful story, and it's a really it's an amazing. It's a very real story. It's an amazing place, Kotti and the communities around there. It has been a very special place for a long time. That fighting back, that kind of finding the lost connections in the title of the book, the remaking those connections. Is this your fighting back? Is this book your fighting back?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, I'll tell you about that in relation to the hardest part of the book for me to write about. I forced myself to talk about this. I don't find it easy. For reasons you'll become clear why I make myself talk about it. So one of the causes of depression and anxiety that I learned about was discovered in a slightly weird way. And if I tell you this, you can't really understand it if you don't understand that story. If I tell you this story, for a minute you're going to think, what is this guy talking about? Why is he telling us this? It's got nothing to do with depression. It led to a breakthrough in depression. In the mid-1980s, in San Diego, in California, a doctor called Vincent Felitti was given a quite difficult task. He was approached by the big medical provider there, Kaiser Permanente, and they said, we've got a really big problem. We've got, all over the US, but particularly in California at that time, there was a massive and growing obesity crisis, right? And they said to him, everything we are trying is not working. We give people diet plans, we give them health advice, and every year they get fatter. They gave him a really big budget and they said, just figure out what the hell we can do about this, right? Let's just do blue skies thinking. So he started to work with 250 extremely obese people who weighed more than 400 pounds, right? And he starts working with them and he's brainstorming ideas. And one day he has what seems like, and it sort of is, a really stupid idea, right? He said to himself, what would happen if really obese people just stopped eating? And we gave them like all the vitamin supplements they need, like vitamin C, so they don't get scurvy. Would they just burn through the fat stores in their body until they were a healthy weight? So they started to try this, obviously with like super intense medical supervision. And the crazy thing is, in one sense, it worked. There's a woman who I'm going to call Susan to protect her medical confidentiality, who went down from being 400 pounds to 138 pounds, right? Everyone's celebrating, they're totally thrilled that Vincent's being told he saved her life. And one day something happened that no one expected. Susan freaked out one day, fled, starts gorging at KFC or wherever it was, and very quickly she's back at an unhealthy weight. So Vincent called her in and he said, Susan, what happened? And she looked down, she felt really ashamed. She said, I don't know. And he said, well, tell me about the day that you cracked. Did anything happen on that day that didn't happen, any other day? Turns out something happened that day that hadn't happened to her the whole time she was obese. In a bar, a man hit on her. Not in a kind of predatory or abusive way, but a man showed a lot of sexual interest in her. Really frightened her, she fled. It's led Vincent to ask a later session, when did you start to put on this weight? It was actually when she was 11. He said, well, did anything happen when you were 11 that didn't happen when you were 10 or 14? Was there anything that happened that year? And she looked down and said, yeah, that's when my grandfather started to rape me. Vincent started to interview everyone in the program. It turned out 55% of them had their extreme weight gain in the aftermath of being sexually abused or assaulted. 55% is much higher than the general population who've been sexually abused. He starts to talk to people, ask them why this is. He began to realise that this thing that looks irrational, obesity, and is obviously bad for you, was actually performing a function. It was protecting them from sexual attention. As Susan put it to him, overweight is overlooked, and that's what I need to be. But this is a small group, right? It's a small study. So Vincent went to the Centre for Disease Control, the CDC, one of the biggest medical bodies in the world, and got funding to do a much bigger study that led to this breakthrough. So absolutely everyone who came to Kaiser Permanente for medical health care over a whole year in San Diego, doesn't matter what it was for, headaches, broken legs, schizophrenia, anything, was given 2 questionnaires. First questionnaire asked, did any of these 10 bad things happen to you when you were a kid? Things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, that kind of thing. And the second part asked, have you had any of these problems as an adult? Things like obesity, addiction, and at the last minute they added depression and suicide attempts. When this was added up by the scientists at the CDC, they were just staggered. For every category of childhood trauma you experienced, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to become depressed. If you had 6 of those categories, you were 3,600% more likely to attempt suicide as an adult. It's astonishing. You don't get figures like that in science very often, right? And when I went to see Vincent, I remember the first time I saw him in San Diego, walking out, if you met him, you'd really like him. He's a lovely man, right? A good, decent man. And I was unbelievably angry when I met him. I remember walking out and fuming and really snapping at people and going to the beach and being enraged. I was thinking, why am I so angry with this guy? And I began to think about it, and I realised I think it helps me to understand why I clung to this simplistic chemical imbalance theory of depression for so long, even though I knew intuitively that couldn't be the whole picture. Because when I was a child, my mother had been ill, my dad had been in a different country, and from an adult in my life, I'd experienced some very extreme acts. I didn't want to think about that. I didn't want to give this individual power over me now. I didn't want to think it was playing out in my life, and what Dr. Felici was doing was forcing me to think about that. But I'm really glad I stayed with him, because what he discovered next, I think, is the most important part for everyone here. So if you had indicated on that form that you had experienced one of these forms of childhood trauma, your doctor was told, next time this person comes in, don't call them back, but next time this person comes in, say something like this to them. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry to see that when you were a child you were sexually abused, or whatever the form of abuse was. I'm really sorry. That should never have happened to you. Would you like to talk about it? And a significant minority of people said, I don't want to talk about it. Most people did want to talk about it, and on average, they wanted to talk about it for 5 minutes. And at the end of it, it was randomized. Some of them were told they could be referred to a therapist to talk about it more. What was incredible was just those 5 minutes of an authority figure saying, I'm really sorry, this shouldn't have happened. That alone led to a really significant fall in depression and anxiety. The people who referred to a therapist had an even bigger fall. And I think this fits with a wider body of evidence about shame, right? There's an amazing guy called Professor James Pennebaker at Florida State University who's done a lot of work on this. Shame destroys you. Shame is physically corrosive. That we know, for example, in the AIDS crisis, openly gay men died on average 2 years later than closeted gay men, even when they got healthcare at the same time, right? Shame destroys you. And giving people places to release their shame, where they can see that they'll be loved and valued, that is an antidepressant, right? It's not a drug you take, but that's one of the many antidepressants that I write about in the book.
Thank you. That was a really hard but good to hear. I've asked you too many questions, as I always do with people when it's interesting. We are now going to hand over to questions from the floor. It's a very busy room, so I'll just ask you for your patience. We have a roving mic, and one of the volunteers is going to come to you with that, but it might take just a few moments to get to you. So who has a question for Johann? Straight there in the back.
I've always had this secret urge, when microphones go to people, to be like Ricky Lake in the 90s and go into an audience with a microphone, but I've always resisted that urge. If you chanted "Go Ricky," that would be we won't do that.
Thank you.
I know that one of the things that can often help people who are feeling depressed and anxious is to talk to people that they care about and people that they love. But what I wonder is that often, things like depression and anxiety can be quite a lot for someone else to take on. If often, particularly in teenage culture, they're going through that thing as well. If you think that there can be a line where sometimes talking to people that you love and using them to help you while fulfilling part of your kind of emotional needs might actually be detrimental to the relationship or to the other person, and just kind of what the relationship is and how best to approach both telling others that you care about the way that you feel, and also receiving information about how others feel and how to deal with that in a practical way when it is someone close to you and you're not medically trained.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Do you want to take a few, or shall I answer them one at a time?
You can go.
Yeah. I think that's a really important question, and I think is very complex. I think part of the problem is if we have, think about Kotti, right? One person on their own would not have been able to help Tunkai. It was actually quite difficult, right? But when you had a really big group of lots of connections, they could help him. And in a similar way, I think part of the problem is we have such a lonely culture where we have so few close friends as opposed to Facebook friends that actually we put too much burden because there's so few connections. The ones we do have end up being very overloaded, right? It's a bit like the nuclear family. You know, it's really deeply weird to live in nuclear families. Human beings have not done this, right? We put so much pressure on the nuclear family, on this limited number of people. So I think it's more about the more expanded your network and your group of people who love you and value you, the more that can be carried by lots of people. And the more that you can be lifted out of it. I think about, again, that gardening program that I was talking about with Lisa. That wasn't just a few people, right? That was, I think there were 23 people in that group. So these big, I think what you're talking about, the difficulty people have, look, it's inherently difficult to deal with depression, of course, when someone you love is depressed. But I think that's made much harder by the very thin and limited nature of the social connections we've got. So the key is about rebuilding these deeper networks. I think you mentioned a challenge for teenagers in particular. I think a lot about this. One of the places I was trying to think a lot about, I think part of the problem is, and I've got 3 teenage nephews and teenage niece, so I thought a lot about this for years now, and I wanted to think about, I think part of the problem is that those relationships that teenagers have now are very often mediated through social media, right? Or often primarily through social media. And I wanted to think about if this could be playing a role in our depression. So I went to the first ever rehab center for internet addicts in the world. It's in Washington State, and it's called Restart Washington. And I learned something there that I think is relevant to your question as well. It's totally fascinating. The woman who runs it is this woman called Dr. Hilary Cash. She's amazing. And they get all sorts of people at this rehab centre, but they disproportionately get young men, either teenagers or in their 20s, who are obsessed with multiplayer role-player games like World of Warcraft. And she said to me, saying, really stay with me, she said, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games? They're getting the things they used to get from the culture, but they no longer get. They get a sense of identity, they get a sense of community, they get a sense they're good at something and can get better and better at something. They get a sense they can roam around. Today, the average British teenager spends less time outdoors than the average maximum security prisoner. Because by law, a maximum security prisoner has to have 70 minutes a day. Vast majority of British kids don't get that, right? So you can see they're getting all these things. They get a sense they can roam, in the game at least you feel like you're roaming around. But what they're getting isn't those things. They're getting a parody of those things, right? I think the relationship between social media and social life is a bit like the relationship between porn and sex, right? I'm not anti-porn, it's going to meet a certain basic itch for you. But if your whole sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd go around pissed off and irritable the whole time because your deeper needs would not be met. So I think part of the crisis that you're talking about is related to the fact that, I see this with my nephews, how many of, we didn't evolve to talk in WhatsApp all the time, right? We evolved to look into each other's eyes and you don't feel heard through screens, right? Obviously I'm not against social media, it has a place. But the other thing I would say is, if you're trying to express those relationships, sit with the person, make them feel held, make them feel seen. Don't try and do it through, instant messenger.
Thank you so much for your question. And just as a very basic point, I think there are some wonderful resources for people who aren't necessarily suffering depression themselves, but have friends, relatives and partners who are, particularly with Samaritans, to make the obvious point, they can support conversations for you to help build some resilience around that person. So the next question, who do we have? We have right at the front, and then we're going to go right to the back after that. It's on its way to you right now.
Hurtling towards you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you.
Hi.
If I understood your book correctly, vaguely, a lot of the causes of what you interpret as the causes of depression are societal, and then
Can you hold it a bit closer?
sorry,
a bit dead.
it's a societal causes which manifest depression, and it's a normal reaction to those causes which turn into depression. So my question really is, why do some people react in that way by becoming depressed and anxious, and why do some people not?
Yeah, so if you've got nine different causes, obviously those will combine in different ways in different people, and so I think so. Sometimes what people like to say to me is, I had this conversation the other day with someone who said, "Well, this can't be right because I've got everything a person could possibly want, and I'm still depressed, right?" And I said to him, "Tell me what you've got that everyone could possibly want." And he said, "Well, I've got loads of money, I've got a hot wife, I've got a great car." I was like, wait, these are not the things you need, right? Well, there may be things that are nice to have, but they're not the essentials that you need as a human being. And whenever I hear people talk about that, I always think about, I learned a lot from reading kind of the feminist texts from the early 60s, like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Because what happened is, what you'd have in the 50s particularly, is women would go to their doctor and they'd say, "Doctor, there's something really wrong with me." They would have said there's something wrong with my nerves then, because that's how people migrated up the body to the brain a little bit later. But so there's something really wrong with my nerves, because I've got everything a woman could possibly want, right? I've got a husband who doesn't beat me, I've got a washing machine, I've got a car, I've got 2 kids, and yet I feel terrible. And often the doctor would say, yeah, there is something wrong with your nerves, and give them Valium or whatever it was. Now, if we could go back in time, what we'd say to those women is, right, you've got everything you could possibly want by the standards of the culture, but it turns out the standards of the culture are just wrong, right? You need much more than that. And I think a similar thing is happening now. The culture is telling us we need things that are not the things we need, and getting us to neglect the things that we do need. So I think it's partly that's going on. But I also think why some people don't react this way, I mean, there's a whole range of vulnerabilities. So, for example, if you are controlled at work, you're much more likely to become depressed. That's one of the causes I didn't talk about. But someone might have some control at work, some childhood trauma, no loneliness. You can see how all these things would combine in different ways. Some genetic vulnerabilities from their parents. You can see how these things would combine in different ways with different people. Which is why I think it leads to a more complex conversation. It's what the World Health Organization has been trying to get us to do, to have a more complex conversation about those causes, rather than just giving one very simple kind of monocausal explanation. And once you realise there's lots of moving parts, you can see why, it's hard to gauge why one person would have some of these parts but not others.
Thank you. There's a question right at the back that was next. Sorry, I think it was the gentleman right at the far back there. He's been waiting very patiently. Thank you, sir.
Hello.
Hello. You can hear me?
We can.
Good. I hardly know where to start, because what you say opens up so much, individually and socio-politically. I hardly know where to start. I'll start with a specific question about this, what happened in this council estate in Berlin. In the midst of all this wonderfully nice stuff, did anybody say one word about how the Berlin City Council was going to keep financing Berlin council estates? I asked this because apparently it involved a rent freeze. Well, that's very nice, but if they freeze all the council rents, how are they going to afford it? Now, I'm not really, that's a rhetorical question, I'm not really asking you.
Well, there's a real answer.
That.
There's a real answer to it that's not rhetorical, which is the whole thing was a scam. Basically, what happened is when they built, it was a bit like PFI in Britain, when they built these council estates back in the 70s when it was West Berlin, the companies have been offered this crazy deal where they were basically told, you pay once off to build it, and then you have the profit forever in perpetuity. So they'd made back like 10 times the money they'd actually invested up front. So there were ways they could change the contract. It's actually very simple ways. And in terms of how we pay for good things in our society, you might have noticed, rich people have lots of money. The 8 richest people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2 billion human beings, right? There's loads of money. That money is being spent on bullshit. On the way in here, I looked in the Daily Mail. Philip Green's yacht has like Simon Cowell on it today, right? That yacht is not a productive use of our collective wealth. He didn't earn that money. He ripped it off from BHS and everyone else. So yeah, I mean, it's not hard to find money to pay for these things. It's actually incredibly easy.
Well,
I disagree.
I would dispute that completely, but...
Can I just say so? We're running short of time, so if you have a very short question, that would be great.
I don't know how to say this, it's too huge, but I think you are hugely... You are concentrating on the light side of belonging, and you're completely ignoring the dark side of belonging. Belonging involves immense pressures on the people who belong. I think it sounds to me as if you greatly, greatly idealize the past.
No, not at all. No reason you know this because I write about it in the book, but obviously I can't talk about every aspect of the book here. But so I write, for example, about the Amish, where I went and spent a lot of time. And you're quite right. The Amish have an extremely strong sense of belonging, and that brings with it all sorts of toxicity. Brings with it great strengths. They have low levels of depression, but of course they treat women disgustingly. They treat gay people like me disgustingly. Belonging is a complex thing. It's not a coincidence, for example, one of the places that had the strongest sense of belonging in Britain and held on to it longest, the East End, was also one of the most racist parts of Britain. Group formation can often be about defining yourself against people. So I think you're quite right. There's always complexities with belonging. But the idea that I know it's not what you're saying, but that doesn't mean we should junk belonging. That means that we have this innate need for belonging. We just need to be aware that, like all good things, like love, like anything, all good things also bring with them problems.
I think it's just important to know that there are no unalloyed goods in that sense. Everything has yes. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. I'm genuinely sorry. Johann is going to be able to talk to people in the book queue, but I didn't leave enough time for which my apologies for questions. But I just want to thank you enormously for a hugely invigorating talk, and thank you for coming down this afternoon to listen to Johann. He will be here for about 30 minutes before his train, so thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers.